But there are other people who are actually saying that if you live near, and I'm not discussing how credible it is, but there are people who have raised a health concern that if you live near a wind turbine, that you're more susceptible to certain ailments and serious illnesses.
There's been some. I'll go so far as to suggest that it's, there's plenty of junk science that's accessible on the internet these days, and nowadays somebody can beak off on a blog and can gain credibility for a particular position that really doesn't represent the majority view on these things. So there are studies. There was a study called wind turbine syndrome, which was essentially a pediatrician in upstate New York who, by way of telephone interview, spoke to, I think it was a sample group of about 50 people post construction of turbines, and concluded that there were some annoyance elements to living near turbines and so on, and those manifested themselves through stress or whatever other mechanism to discomfort. And so, but that's a long way from suggesting that there is a causal link in terms of negative health between turbines and humans.
Can you prove they're safe?
No technology that we use today of any kind has been subject to that sort of scrutiny, nor has it been able to come to that sort of conclusion and prove the absence of any sort of harm.
Right.
So what we do is we have to look at the bigger picture, and we have to say, first of all, it surprises me many times when I have discussions with people who raise this, and I'll remind people that it's a very small number of people in the province who suggest this. I remind people that how surprised I am that they're accepting of the status quo. And at what point did what we currently do now become the way things ought to be? As Bill mentioned,
safe for that matter, right?
We have coal.
There are consequences to everything we do.
15% of our energy, or closer to 20% of our energy at the moment in Ontario, electricity, comes from coal-fired generation. And we know, this is something quantifiable, we know that that causes significant health issues and death. Hundreds of people who die each year from issues related to the pollution from these coal-fired stations. And that's not including the coal-fired pollution that drifts across from the US or pollution from cars or anything like that. Now, you might say a few hundred people, statistically that's not much. When we look at the big picture and we say, all right, going forward, what are we going to do to make sure we not only have a sustainable, cost-certain set of infrastructure to provide electricity when we're going to run out of these other sources, but what is going to be the healthiest way to get there? The fact that there are a small number of people in the province who may claim annoyance from turbines, and we could debate whether that annoyance is related to some physical influence or something else. Nevertheless, I'm not sure how people can rationalize hundreds of people dying with a number of people being annoyed. It just doesn't compute. I think we simply have to say, we've got to get here in 20 years. The way to get there is by embracing new technologies, new in our area, they're proven elsewhere in the world, but we need to embrace a new way of generating our electricity here in Ontario, a way that's going to be sustainable, we can count on it in terms of cost, and it's healthy. It's as healthy as anything else, and certainly when you look at it on that sort of scale, wind and solar come out on top when it comes to health impact.
Are the turbines noisy?
Turbines produce noise, absolutely. These are power plants. There's no fooling anybody. And there's a generator standing on top of a tower that might stand 100 meters tall in the air. It's producing 2,000 kilowatts of power when the wind is blowing at a certain speed. If it didn't make noise, you'd wonder if something was wrong with it. Now, there are provincial guidelines that simply say, okay, well, if something produces this amount of noise, it ought to be set back this sort of distance from where people live and worship and go to school and so on. And so we have that framework now in the province. Granted, it's changed a bit from the rules that were in place 10 years ago and even 5 years ago when some of the existing installations were built. I suppose much like a building code, these things evolve and they get better with time, and we now have some of the strictest standards in the world are in place here in Ontario that govern how far turbines ought to be from homes and
right.
so on. So
So people shouldn't be afraid on that basis, you're saying?
Certainly not. I think what people should be afraid of, if we're asking people to be afraid, is they ought to be afraid of the current situation not changing. I think that's more frightening than anything else.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. Bart, let's talk about the business model on the wind power side.
Sure.
Obviously, people aren't able to stick a turbine on the roof of their house and generate wind power in the same way, but is there a consumer application for this? Are there people who are doing this on their own, or is it more of a broader commercial application when it comes to wind power?
We're going to see the bulk of growth in wind power on the commercial scale. I think that's where it makes most sense in terms of harvesting the most for the lowest cost. On the larger scale is going to make sense. The microfit program we talk about, FIT, by the way, is an acronym for feed-in tariff. It's a mechanism borrowed from Europe. In any case, microfit does make it does have an element that looks at small wind. But small wind makes sense only if you can build a structure that's certainly tall enough, and if you're in a particularly windy spot, then that might make sense. But really the business model that we use, where a wind company like us takes the risk, seeks the financing, and so on, to build what really is, in many respects, a long-term, fairly low-margin type of a project. We lease farmland from farmers, and basically we provide them a chunk of the revenue from the project on a yearly basis, proportional to, in many respects, to the amount of land that's taken up or whatever. But that model, in contrast to microfit, which is really designed to get homeowners and residents get their hands dirty and get right into the project and make a margin for themselves. This is designed more to say, listen, for the farmers, they should continue doing what they're good at, and that's conventional farming, and that can carry on in concert with wind very well.
Typical scenario, if there is such a thing, how many turbines would you be putting up?
Under a previous variation of the feed-in tariff program, project size was more critical, and it was really designed around little 10 megawatt projects in each case, which might, with today's off-the-shelf turbine technology, consist of 5 turbines, something like that. In this case, the feed-in tariff program does not specify a project size limit, but what really determines where a wind farm can go is basically 3 main components, each of which probably has equal priority. Any one of them missing and you can't build a wind farm, and that's, you need obviously a farmer who's willing and has sufficient land space. You need access to the grid. When we're pumping in 10 megawatts or 20 megawatts into the grid, the transformer station in the region needs to be capable of handling that. And of course you need wind. So those 3 things together are what bring us to particular areas, and that's how we begin the project.
But how different is the province going to look in 10 or 20 years when it comes to wind power?
It's going to look different. What we're looking at, we touched on it earlier in the show when we were talking about our supply mix here in Ontario, and at the moment what we're really looking to do is replace the 20% or the 18% we currently get from coal with wind, solar, and so on. Well, a large component of that, just because of the sheer sort of power per square foot production of a wind turbine, a good chunk of that is going to be wind power, and we're at 1% at the moment of our electricity coming from wind. There's a lot of growth that can happen, and there's a lot of growth that is going to happen, and so we're not only going to see more turbines Eastern Ontario throughout your typical farmland. As we got used to looking at silos, we're going to get used to looking at turbines, but they've also opened up the possibility for building offshore in the Great Lakes and so on. They're not going to see those so much, but a good chunk of our energy on the wind side will come from wind farms built out there as well.
So somewhere in the middle of the Great Lakes, you build a
few kilometers offshore. Yeah. You would
either on an island or some artificial structure.
No, they actually probably much more trivial exercise, with exception of, I guess, the ice damming issues, but they've been building turbines offshore in the ocean with significant depths, either with having sort of a ballasted floating foundation or something that's actually anchored to the ocean floor. Building something in Lake Erie, which is effectively a cookie sheet by comparison, would probably be rather simplistic from a foundation standpoint. But those would essentially be anchored to the bottom and stand out there and have a cable to shore. And again, harvest what is probably a more consistent and more powerful wind resource than you're going to find onshore anywhere.
All right, let's introduce our next guest. Lisa MacLeod is the Progressive... Lisa MacLeod, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Lisa MacLeod, the MPP for Nepean Carleton. So, quick reaction to what she had to say?
Sure. I'll just touch on the health thing a bit because that strikes an emotive chord, I think, with people. It's certainly people ought to be concerned. I would say every time somebody's concerned, it should lead them to a point of looking for rational answers and looking to science. And what we've had is, you heard Ms. MacLeod mention the, Health Canada coming out with a statement. Well, what we've had quite categorically from Ontario's public medical officer of health, as well as the one from the Ottawa region, have stated very clearly that there's, based on peer-reviewed science that's out there, there's absolutely no causal link between human health and wind turbines. There aren't many other things we get that kind of an, assurance from other technologies. And so proceeding with this, we feel we've got certainly a seal of approval from the medical community.
Bill, we only have about 30 seconds left, but Lisa MacLeod was suggesting we're moving too fast on some of this. Do you agree with that or disagree?
We're 30 years behind where we should be.
Okay, so you disagree then?
Totally. Sorry, I didn't want to say that publicly.
All right, well, thank you to all three of you for joining us, and it's going to be interesting to watch this develop over the years to come. It sounds like things are going to change a lot in terms of how we get our electricity in this province.
For good reason.
And thank you for watching. We'll look forward to seeing you on Monday's program on Talk Ottawa. Thanks for watching. Good night.